Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to my channel. My name is Amy. I'm also known as Knee Knits here on YouTube and on Instagram. I am a knitter. I love all things knitting and yarn, and today's episode is all about yarn, and we're doing a yarn review with Hobbii. So I hope you stick around and watch. Hobbii reached out to me and asked if I wanted to try some of their yarns. And if you haven't heard of Hobbii, they are a yarn brand based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Now, I personally have never used their yarn before, but I've heard all about them. So I'm really excited that they asked me to test out some of their yarns. So they did send me these yarns, however, all the opinions and thoughts I'm going to share are my own. You can shop their yarn and products at hobbii.com. They sell yarn, notions, and other knitting and crochet accessories. You can shop for yarn and sort by fiber. They have a lot on their website, so it can be a little overwhelming when you first go on, but you can filter by fiber. Hobbii also has a very extensive pattern library, and they have a lot of free patterns, and if you want access to even more patterns, you can become a Hobbii Plus subscriber. Now, when you become a Hobbii Plus subscriber, you get access to more patterns created by designers around the world. You get 3 patterns for free per month, as well as double points and extra discounts on your Hobbii orders. They also will throw in a free gift with every order you make as a Hobbii Plus subscriber. Hobbii also sells on their app, and every Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, they have a virtual bingo game, and you can play for the chance to win different prizes from Hobbii. Now, let's get into the yarn that they sent me. So Hobbii asked me to pick out 3 to 4 different yarns to try. So I picked out 4 different yarns of varying fibers. I wanted to get a good feel for, their whole range of what they offer. So every yarn that I picked is pretty different from each other. So the first yarn that I picked is the baby cotton. So this is the baby cotton. It is sold in 50-gram balls. It's a 100% Egyptian cotton fingering weight yarn. The 50-gram ball will get you 170 meters, which is approximately 186 yards of yarn. They have a pretty wide color selection of this cotton yarn. It is mostly pastels, but they do have a few saturated colors. The color that I have here is titanium, also number 4 on their website. I think all of their yarns, every color name is associated with a number, so I'll try to say both. I think they're both good descriptors, and sometimes the number is easier to find on the website than the name. So this is titanium. I would describe it as a bone color. It's sort of a cool toned leaning gray, but it's a very pale gray. It is fingering weight, although when knitting it, I would describe it more as a heavy fingering or even sport weight yarn. The suggested needle size for this yarn is 2.5 to 3.5 millimeter needles, and I made a gauge swatch on 3 millimeter needles, which I will show here. So this is my gauge swatch, and every gauge swatch that I made for these yarns, they're all washed and blocked. I think that's a very important factor when trying out yarns, that you do have to give them a wash and dry before you can judge how they are. So all of these swatches are going to be blocked for you guys. So this is a 2x2 rib swatch that I made on 3 millimeter needles, and first impressions of this yarn were excellent. It is very soft in the ball, and it's just as soft to knit it up. I did not have any issues with splitting. There's no stiffness. There's no stray fibers. After I washed it, the stitches evened out. This rib sort of expanded a little bit, and I'm super excited to work with this yarn. Some pattern ideas that I have in mind for it are summer projects like tank tops or lightweight t-shirts. One pattern that I've had on my queue for a while is camisole number 5 by My Favorite Things Knitwear, which calls for a fingering weight yarn. So because this is cotton, I think it would be great for the summer top. I knit the 2x2 rib swatch for the purpose of seeing how this yarn would knit up for the pattern, and I am sold. The stitches have great definition. The stitches are very even and smooth, and this feels like a very breathable, comfortable fabric to wear on the body. So I would recommend any sort of, close to skin summer top, like a tank top, cami, even a summer t-shirt. If you have a DK weight pattern, I think you could hold this yarn double and get a really nice fabric from it at a DK weight. So yeah, that's baby cotton. All right, so the next yarn that I selected to try out is called Metallico. Now, this is a 70% polyamide, 21% acrylic, and 9% merino wool. And you can tell that this yarn gets its name from its shine. It has a very foil-like shine, hence the name Metallico. I selected the color powder, which is labeled number 2 on their website, which is a beautiful pale powder pink. Now, this is a 50-gram ball. You'll get 115 meters, which is approximately 126 yards of yarn in one ball. It is a worsted weight yarn, so it calls for 4.5 to 5 millimeter needles, and I made a gauge swatch. Now, when I was swatching this yarn, I originally used 5 millimeter needles, and I found that the gauge swatch was too loose. I didn't like the fabric. The stitches were coming out uneven. So I dropped down to a 4.5 millimeter needle size, and I thought that the fabric that this created was much better suited from that needle size. First impressions of the yarn, it's very soft. It does not have any inkling of stiffness or roughness from the metallic color. I feel like a lot of times if you see something that has this metallic-y shine, you're going to associate it with foil and like the stiffness that comes with foil, but there is no hint of that at all. If anything, I would say this gives more of like an ethereal glow than like a foily effect on the yarn. Now, that may also be the color that I chose. If you look at the website, the color range for this yarn is pretty limited, although it does sort of fit in the Metallico theme. I saw a lot of jewel tone, deep tone colors. They have some gold, some leaning silver, and some funky colors like a gold and a blue mashed up. I thought was pretty interesting. Now, this yarn is hand wash only, and it is a chainette construction, and one thing I noticed, I feel like it does not have a lot of structural integrity. As I was knitting it, sometimes the brushed fabric of the yarn would get snagged or sort of get pulled. Other times, like I said with the 5 millimeter needles, it was just like, didn't really feel like a good fabric. So for recommendations for this yarn, I would love to see this in a knit accessory. I can totally picture this in like a stockinette knit headband. One pattern that I'm interested in is the Easy Headband by Sari Nordlund, which is a stockinette knit tube that's twisted and then sewn up to create a doubly thick fabric headband. And I would also think that a pair of fingerless gloves in this yarn would really make the shiny effect highlighted in that project. I think small accessories for this yarn would be really nice. Don't know if I would make this into a whole garment, like a sweater. It just feels a little bit too unstable to be a good sweater. I don't know if that's a good descriptor, but the fabric just seems more akin to accessories and smaller knit items like the headband or the fingerless gloves. So check out Metallico if you're interested in something like this. Pretty unique. Haven't really seen many yarns like it. This next yarn here is Mohair Delight. Now, Mohair Delight is a 50% mohair, 50% acrylic yarn. I chose the color white, number 1 on the website. It's sold in 50-gram balls. You get 150 meters or approximately 164 yards per ball. It is a worsted weight yarn. It calls for 4 to 6 millimeter needles, anywhere in that range. Hobbii advertises this yarn as a substitute for a mohair lace weight held with another yarn. If you've knit a few patterns before, especially garments, you may notice that a lot of pattern designers like to call for a wool held with a lace weight mohair together to create a fabric that not only has structural integrity from the wool, but has this very nice soft halo from the mohair. Not only is it more affordable than holding the silk mohair and wool together, but you also don't have to keep track of 2 balls of yarn at the same time. You could just purchase this, and because it's a worsted weight, that you could just hold it single and then knit your garment from there. I think that's a really cool idea, so I was very intrigued by this. Definitely wanted to try it, so I'm glad that I got to. First impressions of the yarn, it is soft. It is not as soft as a silk mohair yarn. Kind of has that stiffness, and the fibers are not as soft as a silk mohair. It doesn't have the same sheen that you may get from a silk mohair, probably because there is no silk in this yarn. So just keep that in mind. If you do like the look of silk mohairs for the sheen, you're not going to get that from this. You may see, I don't know if you can see in the video, but these fibers are flying off the ball. And I noticed that when I was knitting up my gauge swatch, which I have over here. I was wearing black leggings, I was knitting in this white mohair yarn, and by the end of just this little gauge swatch, I was covered in fibers. So that was one con of the yarn that maybe keep in mind if you are interested in this. It makes me a little bit hesitant to knit a whole garment in it, but I do want to give this yarn a fair chance. So some patterns that I could see myself knitting with this yarn include the Cumulus blouse by Petite Knit, which normally calls for 2 strands of lace weight mohair held together, and I did knit the gauge swatch out of this Mohair Delight based on that pattern, and I was able to get the same gauge from this one strand of worsted Mohair Delight. So I think that in this winter white kind of snowy color that Cumulus blouse would just be like the perfect winter piece to wear. I would also love to see this in like a cardigan or a wrap. This yarn is hand wash only, which I was surprised because it's 50% acrylic, but it is 50% mohair, so maybe that's why you have to hand wash it. The color selection for Mohair Delight, I feel like it's excellent. They had a very wide variety of colors that spanned the whole rainbow. They had muted tones, they had saturated tones. I really liked the sort of sage green that they had, although I chose the white instead. So if I were to get this yarn again, I would definitely try some other colors, but I've never knit in pure white before in sort of this winter mohair yarn, so I'm excited to try it out. So the last yarn that I selected from Hobbii to try out is Winter Glow. And you're probably thinking, wow, that is a huge ball of yarn. And it is. It's like almost as big as my face. So Winter Glow is this gorgeous self-striping variegated yarn. It is a 51% wool, 49% acrylic, single ply, worsted weight yarn. That was a lot of terms. Everything's going to be linked below, so if you miss any of the key details, you can check out the links and go to the Hobbii website and see them all listed for you. But this yarn really caught my eye. I normally shop just for solid color yarns, but every once in a while I can appreciate a self-striping or a multicolored variegated yarn, but I still don't like to go crazy with the colors. So you can see here I picked a pretty neutral color. This is number 27 on the website. It is described as neutrals, beige, gray, and sand. And I thought it was interesting that this didn't mention green in the description, but I feel like a lot of the colorway is sort of like a earthy green, as well as you can see like the mustardy color. And again, this is going to look different depending on the lighting as well of where you are. So this giant ball of yarn is 200 grams. You get 700 meters per ball, which is about 766 yards. Like I said before, it's a worsted weight, so it calls for 4.5 to 5 millimeter needles, and it is pretty loosely spun in single ply, so that kind of gives it this sort of like rustic texture. It is very soft. It feels like 100% wool to me, and a very soft 100% wool. So I was super excited about the idea of making this into the terrazzo sweater by Petite Knit. Now, Petite Knit's terrazzo sweater is pretty infamous for using a similar subtly color changing yarn, so I was very excited at the concept of using a more affordable alternative from Hobbii for that pattern. So I made a gauge swatch following that pattern's gauge. So this is on 5 millimeter needles. I made a gauge swatch and it matched perfectly, which I was super excited. Like the gauge swatch was good for the pattern. And the fabric, very soft. I love the drape. It feels very airy, but still warm. You can see the striping. Now, a yarn like this, a small gauge swatch is not going to represent the striping effect from this yarn. You can see that the color changes are very slow. So knitting a garment from this yarn is not going to give this very short striping effect that I have in the gauge swatch. So I immediately cast on the sweater because I wanted to see how the yarn color changes were going to look in a longer stitch count. So I have that project started here, and I'm going to show you guys how the yarn turned out. So this is the beginnings of the Terrazzo sweater by Petite Knit. I'm using that Winter Glow yarn just held by itself on 5mm needles, and look at those colors. Wow. Really nice. Very gentle, not abrupt color changes. I did not get any significant pooling except for maybe this, where is it? This small section right here on the sleeve. You might call that pooling, although I'm not really sure, because you can see some of the areas have very quick color changes and some have long, and that's why I really like this yarn, because it's always changing. It's gonna give a very overall like mature vibe. You know, you're not having blocks of stripes, which I think add to this pattern if that's the style that you're looking for with a self-striping yarn. Now, one thing to note about this yarn, it is advertised as having a thick, thin texture. So the yarn itself, if you can see closely, that it's not a super uniform wind or spin. You can see some areas are thinner than others. Now that's advertised on the website as sort of like a feature of this yarn. However, I think that's the one thing, if I was to pick one thing about this yarn that I didn't like, it would be that, because as you're knitting it, you'll occasionally get thinner pieces of the yarn and your fabric will look more uneven at that point because it's such a subtle change in thickness. Now, there are yarns that are advertised as having the thick, thin texture, but it's a much more dramatic change in yarn thickness. And when you're knitting with those types of yarns, you know, you buy those yarns for that texture, and the fabric has that very dramatic change. This yarn here, it just is not dramatic enough to make a visible difference. And if anything, if you look closely, you may notice, oh, that piece of fabric looks a little sparse. Like, did something go wrong? I feel like it gives more of like a unprofessional look and less neat look. So that would be my only con about this yarn. Now, to combat that, you might want to hold this yarn with a lace weight mohair to sort of fill out those gaps, and you won't have that unevenness in the swatch. I've been motivated to keep on knitting this even though I have other projects on the needles, just because I love the color changes so much. Now, they have a bunch of different colors that would suit any color palette that you're interested in. I went for the more neutral color, but they have a lot of more saturated colors, deeper colors, bright colors. So definitely check that out online if you're interested. If you're not super into sweater knitting, other uses for this yarn, I think it would be excellent in a shawl or a scarf, you know, something big and long that's really going to highlight these subtle color changes. Hobbii does have a pattern on their website for this yarn called the Limestone Shawl. That is a free pattern, so if you're interested in that, I would definitely check it out. Okay, the last thing that I got from Hobbii, I did not ask for, so it was a little free gift, and it's this cute little llama bag, and it's a great project bag. It's perfect for a skein of yarn or two. It has this loop handle structure here, so you can actually put your items in the bag. You thread the larger handle through the smaller one, and it's a little wrist bag. All right, so that is all that I have for today's video. Thank you guys for watching. Again, if you're interested in any of the yarns that I talked about today, they are all linked below in the description box. Definitely check out Hobbii and Hobbii Plus if you're interested in subscribing in their program for free patterns and extra bonuses every month. I look forward to seeing what you guys are interested in the comments. Let me know what your favorite yarn was that I reviewed today. Would love to have more yarn review videos in the future. So thanks guys for watching.